Did the slaves jump for joy when they heard the news that they were all newly emancipated? Some did. But what about the others? How did they respond to this new reality that had been suddenly thrusted upon them? Let's take a look into Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, and let's see some of these mixed responses to what many of us hearing this commentary today would call the good news. Here we go. Where the master assembled the blacks to tell them they were no longer his slaves, the reactions he provoked gave rise to the legendary stories of a Day of Jubilo, in which crowds of ecstatically happy blacks shouted, sang, and danced their way into freedom. You have to watch how some people try to tell the story, because some will make it appear like Negroes were at a Kirk Franklin concert in the middle of the streets as they left the plantation. And for most of the slaves, that's not how it happened. Large numbers of former slaves recalled no such celebration. Remember, over 2,000 former slaves who lived during this time were interviewed, and that's where Dr. Litwack is drawing his conclusions from. And from those interviewed, a large number of them don't remember the Kirk Franklin concert. Although not entirely myth, the notion of a jubilee, with its suggestion of unrestrained, unthinking black hilarity, tends to neglect, if not demean, the wide range and depth of black responses to emancipation, including the trauma and fears the master's announcement produced on some plantations. Because a lot of them were scared, which is normal for most people when they step out into the unknown, right? Freedom wasn't something that they knew about, and while there were those who courageously looked forward to facing the new reality, others were not on that frequency. The very nature of the bondage they had endured, the myriad of experiences to which they had been exposed, the quality of the ties that had bound them to their white folks, and the ambivalence which had suffused those relationships were all bound to make for a diverse and complex reaction on the day the slaves were told they no longer had any masters or mistresses. Capturing nearly the full range of responses, a former South Carolina slave recalled that on his plantation,
some were sorry, some hurt, but a few were silent and glad.
From the perspective of the mistress of a Florida household,
some men cried, some spoke regretfully, and only 2 looked surely and had nothing to say.
Some were crying, some didn't want it to happen. Yes, some did not want it to happen, and we'll see that as we continue going. But in this mistress's household, only 2 looked like they were ready for this reality. Although celebrations seldom followed the master's announcement, numerous blacks recalled taking the rest of the day off, if only to think through the implications of what they had been told. Still others, like Harriet Robinson, remembered that before the master could even finish his remarks,
over half them was gone.
That's all of you who've been watching and understanding the message. You're not the N-words, but the point is that if you were on the plantation, you would have been one of those who left, because the message in these commentaries is purposely designed to resonate only with those types of people, right? That's the dividing the sheep from the goats, like Jesus talks about in the gospel. But understand also that there's no hard feelings for the ones that wanted to stay, right? They're just a different type of people. Now let's continue. But the slaves on an Alabama plantation stood quietly, stunned by the news.
We didn't hardly know what he means,
Jenny Proctor recalled.
We just sort of huddle round together like scared rabbits, but after we know what he mean, didn't many of us go because we didn't know where to have went.
None of them knew what to expect from freedom, and they interpreted it in many different ways, explained James Lucas, a former slave of Jefferson Davis, who achieved his freedom at the age of 31.
They all had different ways of thinking about it. Mostly, though, they was just like me. They didn't know just exactly what it meant. It was just something that the white folks and slaves all the time talk about. That's all. Folks that ain't never been free don't rightly know the feel of being free. They don't know the meaning of it. Slaves like us, what was owned by quality folks, was satisfied and didn't sing none of them freedom songs.
The slave roster on his plantation didn't sing "Swing Down, Sweet Chariot, Coming Forth to Carry Me Home." Why not? Because he was owned by quality folks. So from his view, there was no need to sing and pray about emancipation. He was good where he was at, right? And guess what? I don't find anything wrong with what it is if that's how he wanted to live his life. He's just a different type of person than us. Suspicious as they might be of the white man's pronouncements, some blacks were initially skeptical, thinking it might all be a ruse, still another piece of deception calculated to test their fidelity. With that in mind, some thought it best to feign remorse at the announcement, while others needed to determine the master's veracity and sought confirmation elsewhere, often in the nearest town, at the local office of the Freedmen's Bureau, or on another plantation. When his master explained to him that he was now a free man, Tom Robinson refused to believe him.
"You're joking me," I says.
Until he spoke with some slave neighbors.
I wanted to find out if they was free too. I just couldn't take it all in. I couldn't believe we was all free alike.
He was someone that looked forward to the day, so this really was the good news for him. Nor did some slaves necessarily welcome the news when they fully understood its implications for their own lives. The sorrow which some displayed was not always pretense. To those who were reasonably satisfied with their positions and the relations they enjoyed with the white family, freedom offered no immediate cause for rejoicing.
"I was faring pretty well in the kitchen,"
Alec Trimble remarked.
"I didn't think I ever see better times than what them was, and I ain't."
The kitchen life was working out mighty well for this gentleman, right? That emancipation thing came around and messed up his entire situation that he had going on. And since then, he never saw better days, according to him. He's just a different type of person. That was how Molly Tillman also recalled the advent of freedom, since, as she boasted,
"I weren't no common everyday slave.
And her mistress refused to let her work in the fields.
I was happy then. But since emancipation, I has just had to scuffle and work and do the best I can."
You wouldn't think to hear a former slave say that they were happy in slavery, would you? Now understand that this mentality is still here today, manifesting in the minds of many people. But the difference is, a lot of them won't flat out tell you that they're content. This mentality has made a pivot under the modern culture and environment, where it hides itself under the guise of being a perpetual victim, right? Those are a different type of people. To Moses Lyles, a former South Carolina slave, emancipation undermined the mutual dependency upon which slavery had rested, and neither class benefited from the severance of those ties.
The nigger was the right arm of the buckra class. The buckra was the horn of plenty for the nigger. Both suffer in consequence of freedom.
This is the exact argument that many of the pro-slavery Southerners presented. Their case was that slavery was mutually beneficial for both whites and blacks. The whites were said to receive laborers, rulership, and wealth, and the Negroes received order, sustenance, and Christianity, right? That was viewed as their reparations, which they already got. And from this slave's perspective, this was truly a mutual beneficial system, right? Now, did all of the slaves think like this? Of course not. But this one did. Let's keep going. Standing on the porch of the big house and watching her fellow slaves celebrate their emancipation, Sarah Brown wondered why they thought the event worthy of such festivities.
"I've been free all the time,"
she thought. This insistence that they were already as free as they wanted to be repeated an old article of faith which some slaves had recited almost habitually in antebellum days when northern visitors pressed them on the subject of slavery. Disillusionment and hard times in the post-emancipation period helped to keep this perception of slavery alive. But for certain ex-slaves, the attachments went much deeper, and neither good times nor a bountiful freedom would most likely have altered the relationships and position they had come to cherish. To some of the strong-willed mammies, whose dominance in the white household was seldom questioned, and whose pride and self-respect remained undiminished, emancipation threatened to disrupt the only world and the only ties that really mattered to them, and they clung all the more stubbornly to the past. Even death would not undo such relationships, as some of them anticipated a reunion in an all-white heaven.
"Who says I's free? I warn't never no slave. I lived with quality and was one of the family. Take this bandana off? No, Dee Dee. That's the last semblance I's got of the good old times. S'pose I is brack. I can't help it. If my mammy and pappy chose for me to be brack, I ain't going to be like some white folks I knows and blame the Lord for all the afflictions that comes 'pon 'em. I's put up with this brackness now, 'cording to old Mrs. Bible, for nigh on to 90 years, and thank the good Lord that everlasting day is most come when I'll be white as Miss Chloe forevermore. What's that, honey? How I knows I's gwine to be white? Why, honey, I's surprised. Do you suppose 'cause Mammy's face is brack, her soul is brack too? Where's your learning gone to?
You see how her mind had been distorted through slavery? She had some strong and deeply rooted beliefs in her garden. Her aspirations were to get to heaven to be a white person because that's the color her soul is supposed to be. Not black, because she already knew that black was bad. Do you see some of the mind games they played on those of the rich skin complexion? Many of the freed slaves who viewed emancipation apprehensively readily confessed that they had escaped the worst aspects of bondage.
I ain't never had no mother septin' Miss Patsy.
A Florida freed woman remarked,
And I ain't never felt like a bond slave what's been pressed. That's what DM soldiers say we all is.
since emancipation threatened to undermine the mutual obligations implicit in the master-slave relationship, some freed blacks responded with cries of ingratitude and betrayal that matched in fury the similar reactions of white families to the wartime behavior of certain slaves. When Yankee soldiers told an elderly South Carolina slave that she no longer had a master or mistress, the woman responded as though she had been insulted.
I ain't no free n***a. I is got a master and mistress. D right dar in the great house. If you don't believe me, you go dar and see.
In Frederick Law Olmsted's account in 1856, he documented Negroes making fun of free Negroes for not having a master. They said dirty free N-words got no master to take care of them, right? So there must have been a segment of blacks who looked at being free as a degraded status. Now, I don't know how large that segment was, but it must have been there because we have two different accounts of people who appear disgusted with free Negroes. Like so many of the older slaves, this woman felt that her services and devotion to the white folks over many years had more than fulfilled her part of the relationship. For the family to abandon her now and deprive her of the security, care, and protection she clearly thought she had earned would be, in her view, the rankest form of ingratitude. On a plantation in South Carolina, the oldest black on the place reacted with downright indignation when his former master read the terms of a proposed labor contract. Indeed, few blacks expressed the idea of mutual obligations more clearly.
Mrs. belonged to him, and he belonged to Mrs., and he was not going to leave her. Massa had brought him up here to take care of him, and he had known when Mrs. grandmother was born, and she was obliged to take care of him. He was going to die on this place, and he was not going to do any work either, except make a collar a week.
The uncertainties, the regrets, the anxieties which characterized many of the reactions to emancipation underscored that pervasive sense of dependency, the feeling, as more than one ex-slave recalled, that
we couldn't do a thing without the white folks.
Slavery had taught black people to be slaves, good slaves and obedient workers. That's how they trained them for centuries in America before slavery ended. And that's a long time of instilling values and hardening a worldview in people's mind. It taught them to be good slaves, and that's exactly what they became in that system.
All the slaves knowed how to do hard work.
Observed Thomas Cole, who had run away to enlist in the Union Army.
But they didn't know nothing about how to depend on themselves for the living.
Of course, the very logic and survival of the peculiar institution had demanded that nothing be done to prepare slaves for the possibility of freedom. On the contrary, they had been taught to feel their incapacity for dealing with its immense responsibilities. Upon hearing of their freedom, some slaves instinctively deferred to the traditional source of authority, advice, sustenance, and protection, the master himself. Now that they were no longer his slaves, what did he want them to do? Few freed blacks, however, no matter how confused and apprehensive they may have been, were altogether oblivious to the excitement and the anticipation that this event had generated. At the moment of freedom, masses of slaves did not suddenly erupt in a mammoth jubilee, but neither did they all choose to be passive, cowed, or indifferent in the face of their master's announcement. Although the classic version of the jubilee featured large masses of people, some newly freed slaves only wanted to be alone at this moment. Lou Smith recalled running off and hiding in the plum orchard, where he kept repeating to himself,
I's free, I's free. I ain't never going back to Miss Joe.
You see the difference? After hearing of his freedom, an elderly Virginia black proceeded to the barn, leaped from one stack of straw to the other, and screamed and screamed. Like Aunt Sissy, many slaves viewed their deliverance as a sign of divine intervention. God's will had been heeded, if belatedly, and in this act lay final proof of his omnipresence. Few expressed it more eloquently than the Virginia black woman who looked upon emancipation as something approaching a miracle.
Isn't I a free woman now? The Lord can make heaven out of hell any time, I do believe.
There it is. Some people looked forward while others looked back. And these are very different mindsets, with seeds to sprout other mentalities when the environment changed and more opportunities eventually became available to those of the rich brown complexion. So I want you to think about that. Think about that as we continue to climb the consciousness out of the pit and decolonize the mind. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.